Welcome back, everybody. This is for English 247 for our class for Thursday, the 23rd. So you'll see in the notes below I have some class updates. For those of you who submitted in paper number 1, and at least according to our syllabus, paper number 1 would have been due on Tuesday. I've reviewed those and returned them back to you. And I had indicated that I'm evaluating them for both grammar and mechanics and putting a letter grade on it rather than a checkmark grade. But you all have the option of revising that paper for a higher grade if you'd so like. So once you review my comments, and if you have trouble deciphering my handwriting, please let me know and I'll be happy to help. Once you've read my comments, you can incorporate them into a revision. And if you need further direction, please contact me. And I just ask that you hand in the original paper with my comments along with your revision, and you'll get the higher of the 2 grades. And you've got up until the ending of the semester, but as you know, this is a condensed summer session. So our semester's end is coming perhaps more quickly than you might expect. And again, in our notes, you can see our course outline, where next class we will be focusing on Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson is a poet. So we're not going to have the same amount of reading. And in fact, you probably would have noticed that I didn't assign any reading on our course outline for Emily Dickinson because I wanted to basically show you a documentary about Emily Dickinson and then allow you to find one of her poems and talk a little bit about it. She wrote over 1,000 poems, and next class I'll provide you with some links where you can access some of those poems, though you might already have a poem in mind that you happen to be fond of, since Miss Emily is so famous in this part of the country. Though the reality is that she also is famous in the world of literature as a whole, not just in New England. But of course, being from Amherst, she has a very special place in New England. And then the class after that is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And while this is a novel, it is a biography that is going to be a very quick read. The story seems impossible. And it just goes to show the strength of the human spirit and the lengths to which somebody will go to in order to retain their dignity and their honor. And it is indeed a true story of a female slave, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then we end the semester on the 5th of July with The Awakening, which happens to be a novella by Kate Chopin. And then on the 7th is our very last class. So this is when we have our final exam, which will be open book, open notes. And what I'll be doing is assigning or offering a series of essay questions for you to choose from and asking you to choose 2 and to respond to them. If we were taking the exam in class, it would be anywhere between 2 to 3 hours long. Since you are taking it online, I'm going to give you a 24-hour period to write the exam and submit it in to me. All of this via PDF to my email, as always. But I don't expect you to spend 24 hours working on that exam. I expect you to spend 2 to 3 hours. And I'm not expecting the answers to be anywhere as polished or as well developed as anything you would write at home. I just want to see how you can synthesize what we've talked about in class. And I believe I mentioned this in the previous class, that one of the best ways to prepare is just to review our class videos and also to review the discussion forum responses that you've made and your classmates have made and my responses to those. This is also when your second paper will be due, though certainly you can hand in your second paper early. And my thinking is that if the first paper was focused on either story of an hour, which was a possibility, but story of an hour as a short story, of course, requires different kind of analysis, much more detailed analysis than something like a novel, or Frankenstein or Persuasion. And then my suspicion will be that the second paper would be either about Jane Eyre, though you could write your first paper about Jane Eyre, but as you can see, we're just in the midst of talking about Jane Eyre, so I don't know how comfortable you might be with writing a paper about Jane Eyre. But for your first paper, but certainly for your second, either Jane Eyre or Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl or The Awakening. Dickinson is also another possibility, but again, as a poem, keep in mind that writing about a poem, again, is a very different kind of exercise than writing about a novel or even a novella. So, but that would be an option if you so wanted. And it would be the same sort of exercise of what you did with paper number one. Critical paper, so you're not required to use outside resources. Approximately 4 to 5 pages in length, but as long or as it needs to be ultimately for you to be able to defend your specific thesis. And this would also be the last day that you could hand in a revision for your first writing assignment if you so decided to do that. So where we left off with Jane Eyre, and as you know, we've been a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to extend the journal for Jane Eyre, now have that due on the 28th, which is Tuesday at 11:59, again via PDF to my email, though certainly you could hand it in earlier. Where we left off with Jane Eyre is that we were talking about the first part of the novel. And basically we left off with Jane being in Thornfield, talking about the significance of the names of many of the characters and locales in the novel. That a field is symbolic of positive associations and freedom and lush vegetation, but thorns are very negative from a symbolic perspective because they can inflict pain upon an individual, and they can scratch and they can hurt. And we see how Jane in Thornfield will experience both positive and negative things in her growth. And one of the things that movies like to do is to focus on the Thornfield episode, because this is where we get the love story with Jane and Rochester. And certainly while the love story is important, we can't negate Jane's early life and how she began as such a rebellious child when she was in Gateshead. And again, how she was able to develop and grow in Lowood. But we also know that this novel has elements of mystery and gothic within it. So those will begin to be answered as the novel progresses. One of the things we see is that this mysterious fellow, and this is where I believe we left off last class, chapter 18, Mason, arrives. And then Rochester, who of course has invited a group of friends over, including a Miss Ingram. And at this point, Jane is rather jealous because she's already developed feelings for Mr. Rochester. And it seems that Rochester is indeed going to be having a union with Miss Ingram because she's certainly of the correct status and she certainly is of the correct background, something that Jane is not. And we saw with Persuasion how important it is to have a match or a marriage that is politically sound and socially sound. But here, one of perhaps my favorite episodes is where Rochester pretends to be a seer. And in this guise, he approaches Jane, or I should say Jane approaches him because he requests her. And he says, quote, "You are cold because you are alone. No contact strikes the fire from you that is in you. You are sick because the best of feelings, the highest and the sweetest to man, keeps far away from you. You are silly because, suffer as you may not beckon it to approach, nor will you stir one step to meet it where it waits you," says the gypsy woman to Jane. Jane's brow professes to say, "I can live alone if self-respect and the circumstance require me to do so. I have an inward treasure born with me, which can keep me alive if all extraneous delight should be withheld, or offered only at a price I cannot afford to give." Now, we're getting some foreshadowing here, some hints of what's going to be happening later on in the novel. But you'll remember that last class I talked a little bit about many of the responses to this novel and how even today Jane is viewed as a rather modern day heroine because of her ability to exert her independence and not necessarily need to rely on a man or rely on marriage. She can rely on herself. And for the 1800s, this is obviously a rather radical idea. It might still be a radical idea in our own time period. And of course, we can say that Rochester is not a terribly attractive character in some respects because he's playing and toying with Jane. He's trying to get her to be jealous so that she's more likely to want to return his affections later on in the novel. So in some ways, he is rather cruel, with the way that he uses Miss Ingram as bait for Jane, and the way that he pretends to be the seer, though Jane sees through the facade. And I talked a little bit about the Byronic hero, about a man who isn't necessarily that isn't necessarily very attractive, and at least his personality. We know that Rochester also is not physically attractive in the sense that gentlemen would be during this time period, but of course he has status and money, so that isn't necessarily important. And I had mentioned the idea of plain Jane because she also is not physically attractive, which would be of detriment to female during this time period. She has also no money and no status, so we can see how she is very much beneath an Anne Elliot from what we would have talked about in Persuasion. But the idea behind the Byronic hero is that there will be some redemption. So if you know anything about the Byronic hero, then you can probably guess how this novel is going to be ending. Chapter 20, Jane nurses Mr. Mason. He's been stabbed, and the reason why and the circumstances are all very mysterious. And she says to Rochester, "If anyone you know has suffered and erred, let him look higher than his equals, to strength to amend and solace to heal." Again, some foreshadowing here about what's going to be occurring as the novel progresses. At this point, Mason leaves, and then Jane is basically no longer at Thornfield because she has been called back to Gateshead. So we're going to have a return to her earlier life. And at this point, Mrs. Reed is an old woman on her deathbed, and Jane, again, being a good person, doesn't know how to refuse that request. And she finds out that her cousin John, remember he was taunting her and bullying her at the beginning of the novel, is dead, probably dead by suicide. So he did not come to a good end. And when Jane returns to Gatesfield, she finds her other two cousins also have gone in very extreme directions as adults. There is Georgiana, who's become a very spoiled and arrogant woman who's looking to marry a rich suitor. She reminds me of Mary Elliott in some respects in Persuasion. And then the other sister, Eliza, who goes to the other extreme, a cold, distant religious woman who's planning on joining a nunnery. And this novel is, among other things, critical of harsh and cold religion. We saw that with Brocklehurst, and the hypocrisy that oftentimes is associated with that, as Brocklehurst surrounded himself with all kinds of luxuries and gave those luxuries to his family, but yet deprived the orphans in the orphanage of any kind of creature comfort or any kind of safety or any kind of security. So much like Persuasion, which is a novel about balance, this also is a novel about balance, that Jane doesn't necessarily want to become the Georgiana, certainly, but she also doesn't want to become the Eliza. She wants something in the middle. And remember that as positive of a character as Helen Burns is too concerned with the afterlife when she and Jane are in the orphanage to fight enough to survive the tuberculosis outbreak. Jane does survive, in part because she thinks living is a pleasurable thing, and she embraces nature and the natural world, which is a message that we've seen throughout all of these texts, basically. And Mrs. Reed, on her deathbed, refuses to accept Jane's reconciliation, which goes to show how far Jane has come in terms of maturity. Remember that Jane is an adult looking back on her past. And it shows how little Mrs. Reed has progressed. She basically is going to die the way she lived, a petty and shallow and mean-spirited woman. However, Mrs. Reed does reveal a letter indicating that Jane does indeed have some family, a distant uncle who is looking to adopt Jane, but Mrs. Reed never gave Jane that letter until now, when basically Mrs. Reed wants to make sure that she clears her conscience before she dies and goes to the afterlife. Jane, of course, returns, but there isn't much time for her to think about this familial relation because Rochester proposes to her in chapter 23. This is a very interesting scene because he's smoking a cigar. If you know anything about Freudian psychology, the cigar is oftentimes viewed as a phallic symbol, and there definitely is a sexual undertone in this text, more so than what we saw with Persuasion, where it was just hinted at. Of course, we're not really going to get anything explicit until we get to Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and The Awakening. But definitely you can see how these texts are progressing as they are becoming more contemporary. And basically, he admits he tried to make her jealous, and at this point, lightning strikes and splits a chestnut tree in two. This is again some foreshadowing. This is a negative omen, and the idea that one will be split into two. Jane and Rochester seem to have become one, but they will not be one. They will be split into two very soon. And then in chapter 24, Rochester talks about how he wants to basically spoil Jane and give her silks and pearls. Jane refuses, which shows such an incredible element of character. And she says, quote, "I will not be your English Celine Varens. I shall continue to act as Adele's governess. By that, I shall earn my board and lodging, and you shall give me nothing." Think about how incredibly progressive that is. The idea that she wants to earn her own way during this time period. And remember, the idea of being a teacher was something that was reserved for single women, not for married women. And yet Jane says she wants to continue. And she also doesn't want to be basically Rochester's pet, as she puts it. She wants to be his equal, which she's shown throughout the novel, right from the very beginning, when she was able to help him, when she first met him, when he fell off of his horse, and also when he tried to basically get Jane to give him compliments, and she refused. So basically, we see how Jane is very different than many of the other people in Rochester's circle, because Jane isn't trying to impress him. Jane is trying to maintain her integrity and her sense of independence, and that's what ultimately impresses him. And also in this chapter, Jane talks about that this is a good way to keep Rochester at bay and keep him in reasonable check, that she isn't going to descend into pathos. So this is very interesting as well. It's in some ways a kind of guidebook on how to keep a male in want of the female, as opposed to the other way around. Chapter 25, Jane has disturbing dreams. Again, there's this idea of omens and foreshadowing. And her wedding veil is ripped in two. And we later on find out in the big reveal, chapter 26, how and why that happened. That Mr. Rochester is still married to Mr. Mason's sister, Bertha, who is mad, who is insane. And Grace Poole, the one who was perhaps suspected of some of the strange going-ons in Thornfield, was basically Bertha's caretaker. Now, this is a very interesting idea, too, about the mad wife who's sort of hidden away in the attic, which was something that was oftentimes viewed in the 1800s, that if there was an excess of passion, that a woman would lose control of one's sanity. Keep this in mind when we read something like The Awakening, so there's a little bit of a hint there. If you've ever heard of the novel by Jean Rice entitled Wide Sargasso Sea, it's the story, or the fictionalized story, of Bertha and how ultimately she came to be with Rochester. It seems that this was an arranged marriage from Rochester's family, that Bertha had wealth, and once Rochester married her, he realized that ultimately she is quite insane. And of course, the way that the novel is written, we don't necessarily know the details of what happened during their particular courtship, but we do know that Rochester was the second son, and we know that the inheritance goes to the first son. And in other words, the world of Persuasion has now just bled over into the world of Jane Eyre, and now explains why Rochester would have married Bertha in the first place. She was also quite physically attractive, and ultimately had no means of divorce legally, and decided that he would just pretend that he was a bachelor, and make sure, because he had a certain level of morality, that he had his servants caretake her in the best way possible, because asylums at the time could be just as horrific as boarding schools could be during that time period. And of course, we know that while religion is something that is critiqued in this novel, spirituality is not. The idea is that one can be religious without necessarily following man made religion. And Jane is very much a spiritual and a religious person. So obviously, what Rochester has done is a sin, and he's going to need to atone for that. Ultimately, what Jane decides is, even though Rochester proposes to her that they go off and basically, if they don't marry, at least that they live as husband and wife, and she refuses, saying that to herself, or thinking to herself in chapter 27, none shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye, yourself cut off your right hand, and resist the temptation of becoming Rochester's mistress, telling him, do as I do, trust in God and yourself, believe in heaven, hope to meet again there, thinking, I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. Again, a little bit of foreshadowing with the idea of plucking out one's eye, which we will see later on in the novel, that Rochester is going to have lost an eye. But Rochester's been blind, really, to his behavior, and he needs to atone for what he's done. In chapter 28, Jane flees into nature and talks about nature being that kind of universal mother who is benign and good. And Jane suffers the physical and emotional pain of being a beggar. Remember, at the beginning of the novel, a young Jane said that she'd rather suffer degradation at the hands of the Reed family than to be poor and live in poverty. And we see how ultimately she is going to need to atone for her sins, and that she will become poor and ultimately realize that it's not a sin to be poor. But of course, we have to suspend some disbelief here, because we are going to get a happy ending. So it just so happens that when she's on the brink of death, after she's gone through quite a few episodes of trying to beg for food and shelter, she comes across a family who takes her in, the Rivers family. Later on, we find out that she's actually related to this family. Again, we might have to suspend a little bit of disbelief. Mary, Diana, and St. John. St. John is a pastor, and he also is rather distant and cold. Not hypocritical in the way that Brocklehurst is, but again, more like Eliza, Jane's cousin. And we know that that cold, distant religion is just as bad as the pretentious, spoiled arrogance that's on the extreme on the other side. The place where they all live, notice how the homes oftentimes have names. It's called Moor House, because this is the place where Jane will find more. It's also called Marsh End because this is the end of the marsh, or the end of the terrible times for Jane, the ending of her pain and the beginning of her happiness. We find out that after Jane is taken in, she basically collapses for 3 days. Think about the importance of 3 as a Christian number, is representational of things like the resurrection, and in many ways Jane does kind of resurrect. It's a physical but also a spiritual rebirth. And this is where Jane is able to tell the housekeeper that poverty isn't a crime, because the housekeeper didn't want to let Jane in because she was afraid that Jane was a beggar. So we can see how far Jane has progressed. And now she can teach others that poverty is not necessarily an ill, which is something that I think Anne Elliot knew on some level when she was friends with Mrs. Smith, but certainly not to the extent where there is no housing and there is no food, which is the situation that Jane was in. Jane bonds very much with Mary and Diana, less so with St. John. He offers her a very humble job of teaching poor children, which again would be very much a step down from being the governess of a governess of a very rich individual. But Jane accepts it and feels, a bit embarrassed that she's somewhat hesitant, because, in other words, Jane is human, and she's still learning as well about humility and growth. And what we find out in a bit of perhaps a convoluted story is that the Rivers family, their long lost Uncle John, has died and didn't leave them any inheritance, which they had been counting on because they aren't necessarily poor, but they're not necessarily well off either. And they could have used that money. And of course, as I had indicated in chapter 31 rather, Jane felt degraded by the ignorance of poverty, the poverty, the coarseness of her pupils, but knew that these feelings were wrong, and she was striving to overcome them. And St. John, as he's thinking about the ministry and he's thinking about being a pastor, he also is struggling against his attraction to a very rich and vivacious woman, Miss Oliver. The thing is that Miss Oliver is full of life, and St. John is not. His focus is on the afterlife. So even though Miss Oliver is a good woman, he doesn't necessarily feel that he can devote himself to her over a long period of time, because ultimately his marriage is with God, and that he needs to pursue a religious life. So therefore he approaches Jane to see if Jane would want to accompany him. This is after, in chapter 33, we find out that Jane Elliot is really, and notice how she took the name of Elliot as a surname. That's just purely coincidental with Persuasion and the Elliot family. That her real name is Jane Eyre. She's being searched for Mr. Rochester, and our big second reveal is that St. John, Mary, and Diana Rivers are all related to Jane. They're all her cousins, because it was her Uncle John who had passed away, and he had had a fortune, and he had left it to his only surviving relative, because there had been a rift in the family, the Rivers family. He left it to Jane. So Jane isn't just an heir, E-Y-R-E. She's an heir, H-E-I-R. Again, didn't want to give that away as you were beginning to read the novel. And basically the rift in the family is that the Rivers mother, basically Uncle John's sister, married a poor clergyman. So basically she negated the rules of marriage for profit or for social status, and we see the consequences of that. Jane, however, doesn't believe in any of this and shares her fortune equally with her cousins. This is where St. John proposes to Jane that she become a missionary's wife to him in India to serve God. Not so much because of Jane's money, because again, she's divided up the shares equally, but more because he's looking for a companion. But Jane doesn't want a companion. Jane wants love. And this is where she denies St. John, and in chapter 35, an event that could be said to be supernatural. Perhaps when Jane was a little girl and she was in the Red Room and she thought she heard or saw a ghost, that might be supernatural. Perhaps some of the dreams of evil omen that Jane has, or the lightning striking a chestnut tree, could be supernatural. Certainly we find out that the laugh is not supernatural, that has a natural explanation to it. But this perhaps is supernatural. And keep in mind that Gothic texts often have at least some element of supernatural or some ambiguity associated with supernatural, that which defies the natural order of things. In chapter 35, Jane hears Rochester's voice from afar calling her. So she returns to Thornfield, and she finds out what happened after she left. That it's been ravaged by fire, and that Rochester basically tried to save his mad wife, Bertha. And in the fire, Bertha perished, and he became maimed and blind. Remember that idea of plucking out the right eye. He's now residing in a country home that he also owns called Ferndean. Think about the idea of a fern. It's lush, it's green, and the idea that there's lots of growth associated with it. And this is what will be the case for Rochester and eventually for Jane. Now Jane is independent, and she no longer has to rely on Rochester's money. But also, she is loved, and this is not companionship. This is true love in every sense of the word. And at this point, Rochester's a free man because, again, perhaps we have to suspend some disbelief. He's become a widow. So now there are a widower. There's nothing wrong necessarily with Jane and Rochester bearing. And more importantly, Rochester has been humbled. He's not the arrogant, Byronic hero that he was in the past. He's not too proud to ask for help. He is able to be dependent. So both of these individuals can be dependent on one another, which is a more equal union. And of course, for our happy ending, is that they've been married for 10 years and they have a son. And some of Rochester's sight returns so that he's able to see their firstborn. So, in terms of some of the themes in Jane Eyre, and some of the themes that I'll be talking a little bit about next class as I also talk about Dickinson, gender obviously is very important. We've got a strong female character in Jane Eyre. I don't know if Anne Elliot was that strong, as some of you indicated in your discussion questions, but obviously you can see the exponential increase in female presence and strength as we continue through our semester. Class, which is why persuasion was so important, and socioeconomic class, and the idea that, first of all, that Jane, this poor orphan, could have enough self-respect and self-esteem to stand up for herself and also to demand equal treatment. It's something that we will see in incidents in the life of a slave girl, not fiction, very real, sadly. And we're not talking about a governance, we're talking about a slave, which is a very different situation. Religion. So this was, as I indicated, a text that was in part critical of some of the social structures of its time, including hypocritical religion. And hypocrisy as a whole is something that's examined in this particular text. So you can see why so many readers might have been intrigued by this novel, and why it is that reading could be seen as such a dangerous activity, which gets us back to the cult of true womanhood, how we began this semester, because reading could implant all kinds of ideas and statements that would be against the status quo. And the importance of honor, self-respect, dignity. So those are some of the themes that I'll talk about, as well as some of the quotes. But I thought that could be today's attendance question. That would be via our class discussion form. That'll be due on Thursday, the 30th at 9 a.m. Though if you need an extension, please let me know. Is obviously Jane Eyre is a very long book. Identify one particular quote in the text that you find particularly compelling in Jane Eyre and briefly indicate why. And I went through a few quotes, but just a few. There are so many wonderful quotes in the text. So identify one quote you find particularly compelling in Jane Eyre and briefly indicate why. And then what we will do next class is put some closure onto Jane Eyre. I wanted you to watch also a documentary next class, and I'll give you the link to that, for Emily Dickinson, which will tell you a little bit about her life, but also about her writing. So it's a nice overview for some of the poetry that she's written. And what I'm going to do for next class's attendance question is to ask you to select an Emily Dickinson poem, and I'll provide some Emily Dickinson links if you don't have the Emily Dickinson text that I had ordered for the class. And just to talk a little bit as to why you selected that poem in your attendance response for your discussion form. Not even necessarily a poem that you understand, as I think I had mentioned earlier on in the semester that Emily Dickinson is a rather complex writer. And as you will see in the biography, there are quite a few scholars who are interviewed who specialize in Emily Dickinson's work, who admit that they don't necessarily completely understand everything that she wrote. She was very much a personal poet. But that ultimately, I think what you can find in her poetry are snippets of great observations. So that might be the way that you may want to approach her poetry, rather than trying to get an understanding of the poem as a whole. It's just a little bit of a snapshot of a line or two. One of my favorite lines is, one need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a chamber to be haunted, which I think is just so astute. But nevertheless, we'll talk a little bit more about Emily Dickinson next class and how to approach that. But I wanted to put some closure onto Jane Eyre next class, and also end things here so that if you haven't finished your paper, well, this is the time to do it. So again, keep in mind that if you haven't already submitted in your paper is going to be due on Thursday, and that is the 23rd. That would be today if you're watching this video on Thursday the 23rd at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.